from a housing scheme with a big, big dream, and a meal once always a million miles away. I couldn't have one every day. And every time that I feel into quit and just give it up, I used to go on my knees and beg and start to pray. Now it's safe to say, me not gonna make them kill me. I wanna dance in the face like that. I'm whining the waist like that. See me not gonna make them kill me. I'm dancing the face like that. I'm whining the waist like that.
Oh, it's a blessing, and it's a blessing, it's a blessing. Hi Dion, hi Jazzy, how y'all doing? Nice to see you all. Okay, so let's get straight into it. Thank you for joining me this Friday evening. I don't know what the weather is like by you guys, but by me, it's a little bit on the drizzly side. So it's nice and cool and dim outside. Perfect weather really for me to, throw on a movie on Netflix or something and take it in. But I wanted to spend some time with you here talking about an issue, a topic, a subject area that I've only in the last few years, last handful of years, 4 or 5 years I would say, become familiar with, which is the concept of ancestral trauma. And then just this week, I learned that there's a difference between ancestral trauma and intergenerational trauma. And so I decided to have two persons that I absolutely love to exchange ideas with be a part of a conversation this evening that is going to be very wide-ranging. I think it's going to cover a number of things because I'm sure all of us here, especially those of us of West African descent or African descended persons, have at some point in time dealt up with the stereotype of black being equated with dysfunctional. So you're just naturally violent, you're naturally stupid, you naturally can't handle money, sexually promiscuous, any number of things, all of them negative, being associated with and affiliated with the concept of blackness. And I want to challenge that. I mean, we've been doing that all month long. We have a week again of challenging ideas before we hit Emancipation Day. And as you know, this is all about generating more awareness and us thinking about things differently as we head towards that emancipation holiday. So let me bring on screen this lady. Hi, how you doing?
Hi.
Dr. Moore?
I am good, thank you. How you doing?
I am well. It's lovely to see you, and thank you so much for agreeing to be a part of this here with me this evening. And this gentleman, hello. Hi, JP. Actually, let me see how I could. Where'd I put you, boy?
How are you?
Ah, there we go. So I'm not right in the middle. I'm well. Thank you so much for joining me this evening.
Okay.
So, I don't know. Have you all had a chance to hear about the Sean Luke ruling? The ruling for the case with Sean Luke?
No.
So, the case had been going on. The case was, the trial was on for the last couple of months. Today was the ruling. And the two teenage boys that would have been held and charged back then for the murder of Sean Luke were today convicted of murder. And the 23rd of August is when they're going to be doing the sentencing. Of course, because they were children when this happened, that is going to have an impact on the sentencing. After the reading of the ruling, and the ruling, it took a while to read the ruling. It actually aired on YouTube. So if you are interested afterwards, I can send you the YouTube link if you're interested, right? But Justice Hines, the ruling started around 10 o'clock in the morning, and she finished reading the ruling like around 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And yes, it was a long ruling because she went through the case because it was done judge only. So there was no jury involved in arriving at the conclusion. And she wanted to be able to lay out very clearly how she would have arrived at the ruling, how she looked at the evidence, because she is functioning as both the judge and the jury. After the ruling was read, I called a couple of friends of mine who are either judges or lawyers. And we were talking about the case, talking about the ruling. And then eventually the conversation shifted to the lives of these two young men that would have been accused and now been found guilty, right? They would have been accused before, now today they were found guilty. And there was a lot of conversation about the impact of the home and the things that can happen in a home that could lead to behavior. So I wanted to use that, I guess, as set induction for us to get into a conversation about how past things can impact on present and current behavior. So I'll start with JP because I like to put him on the hot seat all the time.
Oh, good.
Because he's trying to give off this whole unflappable vibe now. All JP,
Yes, ma'am.
explain for me and my audience, because there are lots of persons I feel may not necessarily have heard about ancestral trauma and intergenerational trauma. So if you can explain what they are and explain what's the distinction, and then I'm gonna put Karen in the hot seat.
Actually, I kind of, if I may, I think it's actually important to talk about trauma
Sure,
first.
sure.
And I actually kind of want to push that back over to Karen.
Sure. So you want me to ask Karen to talk about trauma?
I think so. I think that would
Karen,
be.
JP would like for you to talk about trauma.
Right. Yeah. JP's jumping off that hot seat. And saying, all right, very fine. It's such a big topic, but let's try to distill it. So there's a quote from Gabor Mate, Dr. Gabor Mate, who is a trauma researcher and worker. And he basically says trauma is not what happens inside of us, outside of you. Trauma is what happens inside of you as a result of what happened to you. Right? So what that means to say is that the event in itself may be something that would cause trauma to a lot of people. It may or may not be.
Right.
It is our response to it that really creates a trauma. You have the hurricane, you have the pandemic, you have volcanic eruption in St. Vincent. What happened inside of us? And there's a huge amount that happens inside of us that we know about that constitutes trauma. Our brain reacts in many different ways. It changes, at least temporarily. It may change permanently as a result. Because trauma is not necessarily just one event or the result of one event. There's also the aftermath of the event. So let us say there's a hurricane. It's not just a hurricane and the devastation. It is that 2 years later, we still may not have electricity, and our grandmother died during the hurricane, or as a result of, damage from the hurricane, etc., etc. So trauma can be the result of an event. It can be the result of a situation. It can be the result of a relationship. The longer and more chronic the trauma is, the event is, the greater the possibility of the trauma within the person. And that has an impact on not only within the person, but on his or her interactions, relationships, perceptions of life, perceptions of self, perceptions of the world.
There's
So, for instance,
there's a question here immediately from someone. Alison Henry is asking, if a person had been put at risk of getting HIV, could that be described as, she's asking if it can be described as intergenerational trauma.
is she talking about transmission of HIV from mother to child? I assume that's what she's talking about.
She didn't clarify that. She just said, I have a question. Would people being put at risk of getting HIV be part of intergenerational trauma? So I'm assuming is passing from the parent to the child.
Right. Well, you see, put at risk is an interesting phrase because we're not sure if they actually developed it or not. Because if you did develop HIV, if you're born with HIV, then that carries its own difficulty and trauma with it.
Right.
Because you are always, I'm different, I'm ill, I could die if I don't take my medication. And no young person, no child or young person finds that easy to sit with or live with. Plus, I may have got my mother, being HIV positive, may have got put out. I may get put out by my mother because she's too ill to care for me, so I may wind up in an institution. So, when we talk about what happens in the event causing something that affects relationships and your life, that's a good example of it. Trauma is, just to finish up quickly, we have what we call the small t traumas
Yeah.
with a lower t, and then the big T, capital T traumas. The capital T ones are the ones, even though I say trauma is not the event, for convenience, we'll refer to it as that. Capital T ones are the ones everybody recognizes. The pandemic, trauma. Volcanic eruption in St. Vincent, trauma. Hurricane Ivan in Grenada, trauma.
Lockdown in Trinidad, trauma.
Right. But lots of the little t's can add up and have a significant impact as well.
Right.
So I can't read well, and my teacher makes me stand up in class and read. And
Yes.
I have had people say to me, people who were at the time 40 years past that experience, come up and whisper it to me quietly if I've talked about learning disabilities. You know, miss, I can't read properly, and my teacher used to make me stand up. 40 years later, they're still living with it.
That's me
Okay?
34 years later with respect to math. Don't ask me to add any number that is like double digit numbers in my head. Don't ask me to do any
Right.
maths in my head at all. And I've had people say, well, how you can't work that out? Because I will say I can't work that out. I need pen and paper, or I need somebody else to work it out for me. But it's because of the experiences that I had with math when I was a child. I freeze up.
Okay. So those are small t traumas that add up, and of
Yeah.
course, a certain response in you which has restricted your life in a certain way. Maybe not a major way, it's caused a lasting restriction in your life. So that's a kind of rough and ready encapsulation of trauma and what it's all about.
I like
That's
the
just the
I like the fine tuning there of it being how you respond inside to things that happen outside, because I hadn't really thought about it that way, but yes, it's your internal reaction to external things.
yep.
Okay. All right.
That's where the trauma starts.
Good. Thanks for that. Now, JP, after having, you know, tried to skivvy out of the conversation, I'm roping you back in. So Karen has explained trauma for us and what trauma means. I want you now to help me and my audience to understand what ancestral trauma is, what intergenerational trauma is, and what the distinctions are between the two of them.
Okay. So I didn't ask that Karen address that because I was trying to avoid it. I just think that she's better at explaining it.
That's my story, and I stick into it, JP.
Okay, very well. Well, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Good.
So the fundamental premise of intergenerational transmission means simply what it says. From one generation to the next, there is the transmission of some particular thing. And you can have intergenerational transmission of all sorts of different things. So my principal area of study throughout my graduate work was domestic violence. And so intergenerational transmission of violence was my first sort of coming to awareness of that, or at least coming to formal academic awareness of it. I knew about it a long time, but that's a whole other story. And with trauma, it's almost sort of the flip side of that, because violence frequently results in trauma. It's one of the principal causes, external causes of trauma. And so in the same way that you can have a pattern of violence be transmitted from one generation to the next, you can have a pattern of trauma be transmitted from one generation to the next, and to the next, and to the next. And so once you move past a single generation, you begin to talk about transgenerational
Right.
transmission. And that's often used as a sort of catch-all for all of this that we're talking about,
Right.
at least in academic literature. Transgenerational transmission of trauma may refer to that first generation transmission, or it may refer to multiple generations along which you have the transmission. Ancestral trauma is not something that you'll find listed in, well, not listed in the dominant body of academic and scientific literature. It's actually a terminology that is used by different people who are referring to a historical pattern of traumatization that they believe and understand to have been transmitted down through multiple generations, in many instances over hundreds of years.
So there was an article I looked at today that talked about it with respect to the Holocaust, right? And the impact that the Holocaust would have had not just on Jews that experienced it, but of course their descendants, right? Their offspring and their descendants all the way down to today. In looking at that article, I thought to myself, well, if we can see that the Holocaust has had an impact on multiple generations of Jews and persons descended from Jews, can we not then see that there could be similarities in terms of what happened with enslavement?
So one of the principal people who has addressed this issue in the African diaspora, Joy DeCroix, I'm blanking on her married name, but she wrote a book called Post-Traumatic Slave Disorder, and she did her graduate work studying this phenomenon. One of the things that she talks about is the really fascinating difference in reception to the address of intergenerational transmission of trauma when talking about it with respect to the Holocaust and to European Jews, who, within the context of much of the global environment, pass for white. And the really different response as soon as she began to talk about the same transmission, same kind of transmission of trauma among African Americans. Very different receptivity.
I'm imagining that there was pushback when she started talking about it that
to
way.
say the least. To say the least.
Well, I mean, that would be, racism there. Clearly it would be racism
Yes.
there. But why is it so hard for people to want to embrace the idea that that sort of trauma can happen within the African community?
It depends on who you're talking about. And that's one of the issues with all of this. There's lots of it depends. To a large extent, the study itself is new. It's young. And there are a lot of unknowns at this point. But it began in the late 50s, early 60s with studies of the children of Holocaust survivors. And at this point, a lot of First Nations people, a lot of indigenous people around the world have embraced that concept in terms of colonization, invasion by Europeans over the past 500 years, ongoing various and sundry forms of oppression and exploitation that have been systematically imposed on indigenous people and people of color globally. And so there's ancestral trauma that term gets used in some of those indigenous communities. I certainly think that it's applicable to people of African descent, particularly in the diaspora. But even continental Africans who have been exposed to European colonization, I would say certainly have more than their fair share.
But JP, how exactly? Because I mean, based on how Karen described trauma, it's your reaction, your internal reaction to things that have happened externally, right? Within your environment, outside of you. I am living in 2021, not 1821, not
Right.
1721, not 1621. So how on earth can I be, how can I be victim to something that would have happened several centuries ago?
So that's part of the complexity as well. A lot of the excitement is around the role of genetics in this, which we'll talk about in a minute.
Okay.
There's a growing body of evidence that there are particular kinds of genetic interactions that seem to be responsible for the transmission of particular vulnerabilities and liabilities and challenges across multiple generations. And so we'll definitely talk about that. But I don't want us to get sidetracked into thinking that everything is about genetics. It's not.
Okay.
It's estimated that there were indigenous people in Trinidad and Tobago as long ago as 7,000 years ago. There were well-established communities at least 5,000 years ago, permanent communities, and 500 years ago, thereabouts, Europeans got to Trinidad, and their first response was to remark about what wonderful slaves these people would make. What follows is a nightmarish tale. It's a horror story, except it doesn't get told that way. It gets told from the perspective of, if you will, Dracula written by Dracula. Right? The vampire is the one who gets to write the story. And in the vampire story, he's doing these people that he's sucking the blood out of a favor.
Yeah, he's giving them immortality, you know.
Yeah, there you go. That's what we've got as history for a long time. That's what we've got as history. But an examination of the historical record with any seriousness reveals a never-ending supply of absolute atrocities. I'm not in any way diminishing the significance of the Holocaust.
No, of course not.
The things that were done to indigenous people, and the things that were done to African people who were stolen from their lands, were horrifying.
So, as you're talking about what would have happened to African people and what happened to indigenous people, I had a conversation with my dad a couple of years ago. And this is where I was talking to him about ancestral memory and also the way in which we misinterpret historical factors. He was talking about First Peoples as being warlike. And I said, what do you mean warlike? He said, well, you know, the Europeans reached here and they were aggressive. I said, well, if I show up in your house and you don't know me and I looking to take over your house, you're going to just calmly sit down and allow me to take over your house? No, you're going to defend your house. And then he was talking about, he said this, oh my God, it's an embarrassing generalization that he made about particularly aggressive groups of West Africans that were sent to Jamaica and to Tobago. And I said, what? And he was saying, yes, you know, they're more aggressive, they're more warlike, you know, there's a similarity. And I said, okay, pause for 2 seconds, Daddy, and let's break this down. One, let's just go with the average West African. Why are they going to be happy and calm and accommodating about having been kidnapped from their homes, taken across the sea, and then forced to work? Like, who is going to be happy and complacent about that? Nobody at all. I said, and let me throw this in the pot. Suppose you had persons in higher numbers who would have been parts of ethnic groups within the ethnic groups. They're part of, like, they're accustomed to being involved in military activity. You don't think that they're going to be in a position where they can organize to do things in a particular way? You'd use your skill sets either which way. So, I mean, he kind of paused, he listened to what I had to say, but it falls into what you're saying. We accept the way history has been written, and history has been written from the position of the persons who were the colonizers, not necessarily from the position of the colonized.
Yep. And so when you consider the absolute genocide against First Peoples, indigenous people, and I use that term when people balk, usually people of European descent, balk at that notion. I'm like, I don't understand why that's a thing. Why is that difficult? You can accept that 6 million Jews were murdered, and call that genocide. The entire indigenous population of the island of Tasmania was eradicated.
Yeah.
There are absolutely no indigenous Tasmanians in this world.
But you know why I think it's possible for people to sympathize with the Jews and not sympathize with other ethnic groups? Because of media. Hollywood has been very good at curating the story of the Holocaust. Very good at curating the story of the Holocaust.
So, in effect, what you're saying is if you're at risk of genocide, you really need a good PR firm.
You do. You need a really good PR firm, and you need a PR firm that understands how to use pop culture like really well. So it's not just about ads, and it's not just about catchy slogans. It's about all kinds of subliminal messaging. Because you have the book, your books like the Diary of Anne Frank or the Silver Sword, or there are not a lot of books, and the books end up on school curriculum. Then you have movies. I mean, we still getting movies. We are still getting movies. When a movie about enslavement comes out, people will be like, oh God, a next slavery movie again. And I don't know if people understand how many movies and television shows have been done about the Holocaust. The Holocaust is a whole subcategory on Netflix. I went looking for Holocaust movies the other day. Slew of movies related to World War II and what happened to the Jews.
There also is a difference in narrative form. One of the complaints about slave movies is the ending.
Yes.
The nature of the Holocaust, because it was this narrow cross section of time, right? In reality, there was persecution of Jews in Europe going on for centuries.
Anti-Semitism is centuries old, from the Inquisition come down, if I'm not mistaken, probably prior to the Inquisition as well.
Prior to the Inquisition, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
And so, the persecution was there, that was going on for a long time. But there's this narrow window of time from the 1930s to the 1940s when there is this very specific, focused, aggressive, horrific enactment of violence against people on the basis of their ethnicity and religion and identification. And more importantly, Europeans and their descendants in the United States and Australia and so on engaged in that conflict in defense of the Jews, at least ostensibly, in defense of the Jews. And so in that story, they're white heroes.
Yes, so you have white victims and you have white heroes, and white people get to be the savior, whereas in the enslavement story, the white people are the
villains.
They're the villains, and they don't like to be positioned as a villain in any piece, which is why you do a movie like 12 Years a Slave and you have to ensure that you position some white persons as messiahs in the middle of a movie like that. Yeah. So I get it. I get the whole, whites wanting to position themselves in a particular way. But I agree with Karen. If we're really and truly going to want it, if you're the victim of genocide, you need a really good PR firm, and a PR firm that that understands how to work these industries.
I'm not sure if that would work. There's a Francophone Caribbean man by the name of Aimé Césaire, who was part of
the Negritude movement.
The Negritude movement. And Aimé Césaire essentially said that the very progressive, advanced Christian, bourgeois, modern white would be surprised to discover that there's a Hitler in him. His contention is that white people's objection to Hitler was not the cruelty, the violence, the genocide, the murder, the torture, the medical experiments. It wasn't the viciousness of the activities per se. It was that these were activities that Europeans and whites in general reserved for people like us. And so it was offensive that they should do it to people who resemble them.
Who resemble them. Agreed. I hear you. So the issue still boils down to some groups are more deserving than other groups. White supremacy and how white supremacy works. Yes, Karen?
All animals are equal, but some are more
equal than others. So JP, I mean, we kind of went off track here, but you were talking about ancestral trauma, and you were beginning to head towards discussing the genetics of it.
Well, yes, but the reason that I was talking about history is that not only were historical traumas committed, but systems and institutions were established to maintain the relative position of oppression and superiority by European colonizers. And so it's not just enslavement, but then there are subsequent systems that are established. And so you have an entire slave code that is developed that disenfranchises people of African descent of any legal rights. It was impossible, for example, to take someone white to court if they committed some offense against you. If you were a woman of African descent and a white man raped you, you could not seek justice in any court of law. If you were robbed by someone white, there was nothing that you could do about it. It's personified in the United States, where it was routine that white groups of terrorists would murder people of African descent as a spectator sport, very popular spectator sport, one in which people showed up and took souvenirs and took pictures and made postcards and sent them. Wish you were here. And so there's a whole other discussion to be had about the psyche of a culture that engages in that, but that's a different discussion. And so you had all of that transpiring. You had the development of bodies of law that prohibited people from access to anything that would allow them to increase their social capital, to increase their ability to advance in the world as it existed. Education, no, you can't have that. If you have to, if you're going to get an education, you have to have money. If you're going to have money, you have to have a certain kind of job. If you're going to have a certain kind of job, you have to have a certain kind of education.
So
and down we go.
Complex ways to dehumanize people, a very complex and complicated system for dehumanizing you.
And the systems contain a pattern of consistent traumatization. And so every time you have to deal with the educational system, you're exposed to trauma. Every time you try to purchase a piece of land, you're exposed to trauma. Every time you try to open a bank account, you're exposed to trauma. Every time you make any step forward, you are traumatized for it. And that is a continuous pattern in various ways all the way up until the present time. Right now, today, if I send a resume to some organization or company in Trinidad and Tobago and I give an address somewhere in John, I cannot be hired.
No, you're right. The particular addresses. I mean, this was something I talked about a couple weeks ago on another live that I'd done, and there were persons talking about that, the fact that there's certain neighborhoods, there's certain areas you can't put that on a resume. And I think too, it still exists now. Certain names, you put it on a resume, and you're kind of wondering, well, will my name become problematic? Will my name debar me from getting a job?
And there's evidence that it does. It has not been done to my knowledge here, but there was a seminal study that was done in the United States in which resumes were sent out that were identical except for the names. And so there were resumes that had very white sounding names and resumes that had very black sounding names. And what was found was a numerically measurable difference in the response rate of employers.
Yeah, I experienced that because my name has people thinking that it's somebody of East Indian descent that has applied for a job. You know, so I have experienced, whether it's negatively or positively, I have experienced people seeing my name and automatically assuming that it's somebody of East Indian descent that's coming to them.
Yep. And so what the reason that I'm mentioning this is what we've got is a historical Holocaust level set of events in the first place.
Right.
Whether you're talking about the genocide of the indigenous people, the kidnapping and rape and cramming of Africans into the bottom of a ship, their transport across the sea to a foreign land, being sold at auction, being separated from people, intentionally separated from anyone who shared your language or your culture, so that you could not communicate, so that you are in a place of permanent isolation from everyone, literally. That all of these things have been done historically, and we know about those horrors, but then you have an ongoing system aimed at and intended to keep people in a perpetual place of denigration. And that continues up into the present time. And that is in a society where there is coexisting the descendants of the people who engaged in traumatizing our ancestors.
JP, I want you to stick a pin there because I want to pull Karen in at this point in time. Karen, JP is raising a really important point there. That we are we continue to coexist. People who have been traumatized and the people that would have created the trauma. Descendants of the traumatized, descendants of the persons who would have created the trauma. How do you see that playing out in intergenerational trauma? Because I know that's an area that you deal with.
This is something that JP and I have talked about in other contexts, another context, when we talk about the perpetuation of the plantation. So, the plantation, to be truly successful, is not only external, it becomes internalized in people's minds. So that the people who are the descendants of those who were originally oppressed maintain their same emotional and psychological position towards those who are the descendants of those who oppressed them. And the same on the other side, that those who oppress them maintain that same psychological position towards the descendants of those they oppress. So that gets passed on. It's fascinating how things get passed on. We all know, we talk a lot about passing on values in this society, right? And we think of it as what we say, because we're great believers in talk. We are the children of a Nancy, and a Nancy talks. That's how he gets away with stuff. So we believe talk, you talk, you talk, and that's how everything is achieved. But that's not how values are transmitted. Values are transmitted by your children observing your behavior, your patterns, how you react and respond in different situations. So parents, when we talk about the intergenerational transmission, as JP said, transgenerational transmission of trauma, parents convey to their children, in this context, with this person, you do not have power. So this is how you must behave. In this context, with these people, you have power, and therefore you can behave in a certain way and treat them in a certain way. And that, so all the chat about you are just as good as anybody else and you can hold your head up high. I remember a story, and I will try to make it as anonymous as possible. A man comes to a business which is owned by a local white trade union, and he fusses and complains, and he's complaining to the people who are at the front of the business, shouting and getting on about something that happened. They try to calm him down, they explain, they explain, they explain, they explain. He not taking it. The grandson of the owner goes out to explain to him. Now he knows less than the people at the front because he hasn't been working in the business as long as they have. He sits down the man and tells him the same exact thing. The man is immediately pacified because this is the local white grandson. Now he didn't know it was a grandson of the owner, but he knew it was a local white person coming out who is part of the business to explain the exact same thing to him. Now imagine a child being with him and hearing the same explanation from two sets of people who look different from each other and observing daddy's response to each group of people. So I have transmitted to this child some powerful values right there, immediately.
It also happens with gender as well, right? So it could happen with color, it could also happen with gender. I mean,
Absolutely.
I've experienced that on a number of occasions. I say something and a man says the exact same thing that I said. As a matter of fact, he repeats me and people will listen to what he said because a man has said it. Or
Right,
it might be an age thing as well, where I've said this thing, but because somebody older than I am,
right,
said it, it must be more important if somebody older than I am has said it.
right, right, right. So there's all of that. And in our responses to all those situations, we transmit to our children a complex understanding of the power hierarchy that exists as we perceive it in the world and how they need to move within this power hierarchy in order to survive and get what they need. That's what we teach them by our behavior. Every so the plantation, we transmit the plantation to them. And there's nowhere that we do that more powerfully than in parenting. Because in parenting, we very often teach our children, firstly, that there is a power structure.
Right.
Me, I am the parent, and of course, a parent naturally has more power and agency than the child. But I teach you that I will use that on you, not for you, not always for you, not always with you, not always on your behalf, but I will use it on you.
Well, I want to
So
throw
you
this. I want to throw this in the mix as well, Karen, as you're
uh,
talking about parenting. What about the role that religion plays? Because religion is often intertwined with parenting, and my personal experience is, religion has a significant role to play with these things.
yes, it does. Religion is frequently used by people as one of the biggest plantations out, and that is international. And there are a lot of people, good church going people, who are going to shriek when I say that, but that's how a lot of people use religion. It's just another meadow in the plantation. So we use the religion to back up our use of power on the child that we are parenting, and we have the authority to use power on you and at you and against you because our religion says we can. So I teach you early o'clock, there's a plantation. And as you move through life, and as you watch me move through life and you grow as a child and a young person, I show you where your position is in the different areas of the plantation. So with people of this gender, this age, this color, this is where your position is. With people of this level of education or this level of position or status in the society, this is where your position is. And I teach you that the plantation is all over.
I hadn't thought about religion as plantation. I've often thought of religion as a tool of oppression, but I
Yep.
hadn't I hadn't made that particular connection that the religion is in and of itself, or can be in and of itself, a plantation.
Too often, that's what it's used for, and that's how it becomes a tool of oppression. And it's frequently used in parenting. You must revere me because the holy book, whatever holy book it is, says so. And because I must be revered, I am not wrong. And when I use my power at you, on you, and against you, I'm right.
Yeah. Without being questioned or challenged, because of course you have authority, religious authority to back you up.
Absolutely, absolutely. If God says so, then you can't even open your mouth because God said so.
Yeah. Until I decide to ask who is God, why do I even have to take him on?
And if you ask that when you're small enough, I can slap your teeth out your mouth.
Yeah. You could slap my face, all the way around my head and think, and I look like that little child from Exorcist. Yep, I hear you on that. I also feel that the education system here is used in a similar way.
Yep, absolutely.
Don't get
And
started.
And there's a
get
kind of
started.
nexus. There's a kind of a nexus of age-based power,
Yeah.
religious power, and institutional power. When you get into educational institutions, there's a nexus, a meeting point of these three different sources of unearned power,
Yeah.
unearned and often undeserved power, and its exercise and abuse. But in addition to that, one of the things that comes up with religion, and it comes up with other things, is the presence of structures, the importance of structures in the maintenance of patterns of oppression, and patterns of oppression being sources of trauma.
Right.
And so, one of the things about churches, I'm generalizing because there are churches for which this is not necessarily true. But there's certain iconography, certain imagery that is used. And the imagery reinforces the hierarchy that Karen is talking about, right? And so, you have plenty people who look like me, who have to have the blue-eyed, blonde-haired Jesus, although there was no such phenotypic pattern in the Middle East at the time that Jesus existed there. It's you're not generally going to find in churches people talking about the fact that Jesus was a man of color in a colonized third world nation that had been invaded by a European superpower, where there was a petty ruler who had been set up basically colluding with the European superpower in the oppression of his own people. That's not what we talk about.
Yep.
So the imagery is used there. It's used in other places. And one of the more interesting things for me is that when people begin to talk about taking down statues of oppressors, it's fascinating to see who howls the loudest in opposition. The representation of the internalization of their oppression is fascinating. This person that is being depicted and lionized and held up literally above us all to be looked up to and revered is someone who was responsible for the systems and the patterns that allowed your great-grandmother to be raped, your great-grandfather to be raped publicly as a way of humiliating him.
But we've been taught to validate them. We've been taught to celebrate them. We've been taught that white things, white people, we've been taught that whiteness is a good thing. It's a positive thing. Whiteness is development. Whiteness is civilization. Whiteness is progress. That's what we've been taught.
Fictitious.
Yes, whiteness is a construct. It's fictitious. And when you pause and you think about what development means, development actually is a synonym for capturing people from elsewhere. Development is a synonym for human trafficking. Yep. Right? Rape, pillage, rape, pillage, plunder, that sort of thing. That is what development is for once you're talking about white people.
Yep.
So, I want us to get back to the whole genetic, the genetic thing.
Now I will talk about the genetics because I didn't want us to lose sight of that massive 500 years worth of context.
Agreed. Agreed. Agreed.
And so, on top of all of that, there is a growing body of knowledge that reveals um, a very high likelihood that there is a genetic link to the transmission of trauma across generations.
Okay.
And so it appears that, especially when people are traumatized at an early age in their lives, they are subject to biological changes, including changes in their epigenetic functioning.
What is epigenetic functioning?
I'm so glad you asked. Generally, when we think of genetics, we think of the DNA double helix. And we think about genetic changes, meaning changes to different sequences on that double helix. But that may not be the principal mechanism that is responsible for intergenerational transmission. Rather, the DNA forms a template, and at a cellular level, within the cell, what happens is that what is known as RNA mimics sequences on the DNA strands. And it then translates that over to another part of the cells that are known as ribosomes. And there, the sequences that are recorded effectively, and it's called messenger RNA. The sequences that are recorded on the mRNA are then used to formulate specific proteins, and the proteins then are responsible for different cellular actions, activities, etc. What I just described is what is called gene expression, and so the genetic material, the DNA, doesn't do the stuff itself. What it does is it provides a template for determining which stuff gets done, how it gets done, what it looks like, etc. And so obviously what's on your DNA determines what sequences are formed.
Right.
But what happens with epigenetics is that there are different processes that can affect gene expression. And so there are processes at a subcellular level that can prevent, for example, different sequences from being transmitted for the creation of proteins. Right? So there are a few different processes that happen. And what they can result in, broadly speaking, is either the expression, meaning the creation of different proteins and so on that then produce different effects, or the suppression of those same proteins.
Okay.
And at this point, it seems that there are changes in the epigenetics of people who are traumatized, with the result that what is expressed in their genetic material differs from what it would have been before their trauma.
Right.
And therefore, what is expressed affects what gets transmitted and manifested at a cellular level in their progeny, in their children. And as a consequence, the next generation from someone who has been traumatized may be much more prone to particular kinds of challenges because of the epigenetic changes of their parents.
So, slow this down for me. If my mother experienced certain kinds of trauma, let's say prior to having me, and then even when she was pregnant with me, I could be born with my genetics having been affected by that?
Yes,
And
specifically
I could be
your
more prone,
epigenetics.
right? My epigenetics, and then I could be more. I I could.
Yes.
So, for example, there's evidence that survivors of trauma, the children of survivors of trauma, have a higher likelihood of developing certain mood disorders, anxiety and depression in particular.
So
Um,
her trauma can make me more susceptible to.
yep.
Yes,
And
Karen wants to say something.
yes, sorry, Karen.
Even if you, no, that's okay. Even if you never knew about it,
Yep.
even if you didn't grow up with your mother, even if your mother tragically died when you were very little. So it's not necessarily her traumatized behavior that then created that in you.
Mm-hmm.
Because um, I was looking back through one of my books in preparation for this,
Mm-hmm.
and I was reminded that by the time your mother was born, she already had the egg that would become you.
Right,
Remember
because it
that
would have been
woman?
there. It would have been there in her ovaries from forever, from the time she was really young. Yeah.
It was in her ovaries from the time she was a fetus.
Mhm.
That genetic material was, so you were already there with her
Mm-hmm.
from before
Yeah.
she was born.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. I've been with her for
So
forever. Mm-hmm.
you've been with her for forever.
Yeah.
So when she experienced whatever trauma, the material that would become you was inside her, and along with the cellular changes that happened with her,
Mm-hmm.
you were part of her cells already, yeah? Before you
Mhm.
ever conceived. Half of you,
Yeah, half of
they
me,
have the
23 chromosomes here is in, all Pearl and whatever was going on with Pearl, right?
yeah, they were all there. They were all there already, being affected by what happened to her even before she was born. Not
Does
to
it work?
mention everything
Does
in
it
her
work the
life.
same way with sperm as well, though? Because I'm thinking about the 23 chromosomes of me that is
Already,
also
There's
Claude.
there's actually yes, there's evidence that particular challenges are transmitted through epigenetic changes to sperm in particular.
right.
Listen, both my parents are a cocktail of dysfunction. Right?
Is
Both
there a
my
name for that particular drink?
Molotov. Listen, all they have me sit down here thinking to myself, oh my God, how am I even standing? Both my parents, they have their idiosyncrasies, they have their dysfunctions. And what you are saying to me here, both of you, JP and Karen, is that their DNA would have been shaped and changed by the trauma they experienced, and they have their own separate traumas from their childhood and things come up, and their DNA would have impacted my epigenetics, and so there are ways in which I am more prone or more susceptible to certain
Yes.
kinds of. Oh my God, I need to lie down.
So one of the things that I am very interested in, I've not seen any particular material on it. There's lots of stuff. Like I said, this stuff is young, and
Yeah.
so um, a lot of what is being examined are sort of acute disorders
Mm-hmm.
or propensity for acute disorders, the tendency. And so, a disorder is not something that you're necessarily going to get. What happens is that you have a certain tendency or likelihood of it. And then when you add certain stresses and challenges, it comes to fruition, it comes to expression. Um, and so the tendency for certain acute disorders, including anxiety, depression, and interestingly, post-traumatic stress disorder, um, are greater among the descendants of people who themselves experience trauma. Here's what I am really curious about. I would like to know what is the relationship between exposure to trauma in one generation and the propensity or the tendency, the risk for the development of certain personality disordered characteristics in the next generation.
Karen, have you read on any of that at all? I mean, is there any light you can
That,
shed here?
no, that unfortunately I can't shed light on. But what I can say is that if we take it back, because we've been getting deep to inside the body and the
Yeah.
genetic changes, right?
Yeah.
If we bring it up a level
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
and take it to the brain and behavior,
Mm-hmm.
in one generation that has experienced trauma, we know that there are neurological changes that happen, and those can become permanent. Those can be long standing.
Mm-hmm.
If you are fortunate and you're given a chance to recover, they don't stay long term.
So then let me
But
ask you
then,
this. Let me ask
mm,
this.
mm,
Let's say I can't afford to see yourself and JP, right? I can't do the hourly rate thing to
mm,
begin the psychological archaeology that clearly needs to take place here. So I need to sit down and start thinking about what might be my inherited trauma. How do I start that? How do I start that process?
One of the
that's
things
it.
that I'm sorry, go ahead, Karen.
Yeah, you go, you go, you go.
One of the things that I ask people to do as they're doing trauma work, if they can, if it's safe to do so,
Yeah.
is to ask their parents about their experiences and about ancestral experiences.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's something that I do with my own family. I am constantly, talking to my mother and learning all sorts of stuff and going, oh,
Mm.
um, there's all sorts of stuff. And in our context, trauma is rife. Trauma is absolutely pervasive. And if you talk to your parents and you talk to your grandparents and so on, and you just ask them to tell you their stories, there's all kinds of stuff that will come out and that will make all sorts of sense. And the reason that I'm talking about that is that making sense of things is part of what's needed, or it's one of the ways of healing from trauma. If I went through some traumatic experience and it makes absolutely no sense, I have no place to put it, it doesn't fit in my head anywhere, I don't know what to do with it, and it keeps bouncing back up because it keeps looking for an explanation and a place to fit. It's one of the reasons that we keep having that when you've been traumatized, you may have recurring and intrusive memories in one form or another. Um, but coming to a place of understanding or making sense of what has happened in my life relieves the distress about that. It allows us to kind of find a space to put things. It doesn't change the fact that I experienced some particular trauma, but it allows me a way to be able to deal with it, live with it, and be okay.
So
I
go
wanted
ahead, go
to
ahead,
add.
Karen. After Karen talks, I'm gonna say something. Maybe, and maybe I'll say it. Maybe I won't say it. I don't know. Yes, Karen. Go ahead.
I wanted to add there that I think the step even before getting the being able to put the story together is first knowing that there is something.
Okay.
Mm.
So how do I go
If
about knowing that there is something?
sorry, that's what JP is saying
Mm-hmm.
when he's saying he asks his family. You have to find out that there is something. You have to hear the story. When the story is suppressed and kept secret,
Mm-hmm.
and I mean Freud became famous on this. When you suppress information, sorry, it doesn't go away. When you forget information, it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't stop affecting you. The information that's suppressed, repressed, forgotten has the most powerful impact on you. So, first, you resurrect the story. So, when you said archaeology, you're dead right. You dig up the story. What is the story? Then you begin to connect things and put them together, as JP said. And so you get a story. And every story of trauma is also a story of survival and resistance.
Okay.
Because along with what your parents passed on to you, they also passed on to you a certain resilience. And what they passed on, yes, may be a tendency to react more strongly in certain ways. You can also think of it, as the book I was reading pointed out, as a kind of foreknowledge. I know I've been through this, so I carry the vulnerability, but I also carry a knowledge and experience at the cellular level of this particular kind of
So
experience.
after I get the stories, because I mean, my mother once gave me a story about when she was getting ready to have me, right? Like the week leading up to getting ready to deliver me. So after I get a story like that, what do I do with that story?
It depends on
You
what
do,
the story is.
The story was real traumatic, JP. It was real traumatic. She was getting a lot of stress from her husband at that point in time. So when she's giving me the story, and I got the story very apropos of nothing, right? We were talking about something else, and then all of a sudden it came up, and she was discussing it, and I was hearing all of the tension and pain in her voice, the hurt in her voice over what would have transpired. And I thought to myself, I was delivered in the midst of all of that confusion, right? So after I get a story like that, or anybody gets a story about the trauma that would have impacted them, what do I then do with it? What's the next step for me?
One of the things that, oh, sorry, go ahead, Garen.
I was going to say, now I don't work with adults, but I do this with children. You get to see where the story fits in your larger story. But it's very
Yes.
important to remember that that story is not your whole story.
Right.
Because the
Yes.
fact that your mother is here means that she held her 9 months pregnant belly and said, in the midst of all of this, me and my baby going to survive. I going to have this child. I going to produce this child. I'm going to go through uh, uh labor and delivery are incredibly the most intense experience on the planet. And I am going to do this, and I am able to do this. Now, maybe your mother has not carried that part of the narrative with her,
Well,
but
that's
you are
not. She
here
doesn't recount
living.
that part of the narrative because it's
Right.
not the position that she would be recounting it from. So I
Right.
guess
Right,
when
right.
when I'm thinking about it, that's one of the things I should be thinking about. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And you are the embodiment of her will, that she said, despite all these things I'm going through, I'm also going to do this. She chose life.
Yeah.
She could have chosen, I'm going to cut my throat, I'm going to take pills, I'm going to whatever, God forbid. And she chose life for you and for her. And somewhere within her, because this is something that I've found with survivors of sexual assault, they will tell you the story first from the position of, oh my gosh, this is what was done to me. And that's true.
Yeah.
And then as you keep telling the story, they're able to say where they made choices along the way to survive. That this man was being especially violent, and I realized X, Y, and Z, so I realized I had to do this. Maybe just lie still. So when they first tell the story, he did this to me, and I just lay there. And as they keep telling the story, they're telling you about the choices they made to survive. Your mother made choices for you and for her. And I think you were a very important part of the choice that she made at that point. Because I have this child, and this child had to live. No matter what, this child has to live. So this child has to come out. I have to live. So this child has to live. And this child has to come out into this world and live and thrive.
So in the psychological archaeology, I have to anybody who is doing that work has to they have to they have to look at the artifact, the trauma from multiple
Yes.
perspectives. Then they have to look at the trauma from multiple perspectives.
And within the context of their whole
Yes.
life, some of the trauma narrative takes over. The problem story takes over, and everybody says, "Oh, this is the problem. This is the whole thing." No, it's part of the narrative of your life.
Right.
It's called the narrative of your mother's life, in which she has been so many things.
JP, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, no, I'm absolutely agreeing with Karen, and I'm also agreeing with that on a larger scale as well. I agree with it as an individual thing, and she's addressing it, in this way to you, but it's also applicable at a larger scale. And it's one of the reasons, as I was saying earlier, about challenges that people have with the way that the story of slavery is told and represented.
So, based on what you and Karen have said here, in looking at an experience, doesn't not just mine, anybody's experience, you are you can be both victim and victor, right, of the
Yes,
situation. Both victim
yes,
of the situation, both victor of the situation because you've survived this situation. But I'm also wondering, because we talk about stopping the cycle and putting an end to particular cycles. If there's this epigenetic aspect to things, can you really put a stop to certain things? Because, like, let's say I had a child, and this is the thing I was going to say before. I had actively taken a decision back in my 20s that I really didn't want to have children because of, trauma. And I just felt like, no, I feel I really want to put a child through any of this stress. So I didn't have children of my own. I raised a child, but I didn't have any children of my own. But if I had a child, there are things that I would not have been able to not pass on to the child based on the epigenetics theory. So how do we counter those things, Karen?
But there's a constant dynamic interplay between environment and genetics.
So
And we
nurture versus
recognize
nature, that nurture versus
it's
nature,
not versus,
nature
it's the
and
nature and
complex
sorry,
combination of the two.
right,
Because and we recognize it in medical fields where, okay, there's diabetes in my family, so I am going to tailor my lifestyle in a certain way so that the diabetes does not emerge in me. People
right,
do that all the time. The same thing happens psychologically, only we're so often behaving from unconscious motives that we don't recognize what we are doing. But
right.
it's the same thing. So the gene, the tendency, the vulnerability may find expression, maybe in a very muted way, or maybe not at all. And the pandemic is a great example because, as a colleague of mine pointed out, children who and teens who might have had maybe mild anxiety or depression in this chronic situation of chronic trauma
Yeah,
and stress,
yeah.
it has not become moderate or
Yeah,
significant.
it's kind of exploded. It's gotten
Exactly.
intensified.
Whereas if this had never happened, they might have gone through that delicate period of adolescence without having any major anxiety or depressive episode, which have implications to their later life. Because the earlier you have a major episode of anxiety or depression, the more likely you are to have repeat episodes later in life.
So if we're in a situation where you have this trauma that is unexplored, unexamined, you're probably not even aware of the trauma. And then there is the epigenetic aspect to things that you would have inherited. Those things can obviously impact on people's life choices and how they behave and how they treat with situations without them even understanding that that's what's leading to certain behaviors.
certainly, absolutely.
And don't forget, it also affects how people will respond to them. And so, therefore, how they will behave as a result of how people respond to them and the choices that are made on the basis of that. It's so many dynamics going on here. And the experiences that we receive and that we create without even knowing it have
Yeah.
a further impact on our brain and our neurology.
Yep. And
It's
I
real
will
busy.
bring
Real
back
busy.
in the business of our structural environment. So, made mention of the power structure, the power hierarchy, color based to a large extent, color and gender and wealth based hierarchy that we have in the country that is also manifested by physical symbols and representations, and it's also manifested by material distribution of resources. There's a distinct difference in terms of resources, wealth, etc., across the different parts of that hierarchy. And so when you take that combination of things and you say, okay, so there's a pervasive pattern of trauma that has, call it colonization,
Yeah.
call it slavery, call it indentured labor. There's this a lot of trauma across many of our communities that has been transmitted and is sustained and maintained. The question that you're asking is about what can you do as an individual, and one of my concerns is that we keep looking for individual solutions instead of addressing broader, larger expressions of education, information, care, treatment. We have 1.3 million people, and I would estimate that 1.2 million of them are traumatized. And we are talking about treating them one by one with a few hundred psychologists.
I was just about to say, not even one by one, because I can't even say all 1.4 million being treated, I think
No.
is a handful of persons being treated really. Maybe
Right.
1/10 of that population, if so much, being treated.
Right, and that doesn't make any sense.
No.
And so the business of framing trauma within its context, right? That's one of the things that is very helpful. If I understand that I experienced this particular traumatic event, but it's framed within the context of a life in which but it's framed within the context of
Sorry about that. That was a moving disco on the main road.
we have those, yes. When the big truck passes, that's how it is.
Yep.
So if you frame that in the context of a life that includes good things and important things and valuable things prior to the trauma, and a life that includes good things and valuable things subsequent to the trauma is still trauma. It's still an unpleasant, painful, harmful event, an incident, but it's not my story.
Yeah.
Exactly.
One of the things that I ask people to do is to write chapters of their story.
Okay.
The trauma is just one chapter.
And then what when they've written about the trauma, what do they then have to write about? What's another chapter that they write?
I usually ask people to identify a chapter that they can think of beforehand that was absolutely joyful,
Okay.
and a chapter that they can think of subsequent that is absolutely joyful. Both can be problematic. The previous chapter, the first chapter, can be very difficult.
Yeah.
Because if you're coming from an environment where there's a lot of trauma going on, and that's one of the problems that trauma is often talked about, is there's just this one incident. In formally colonized, not so formally colonized places.
Yeah, because we still colonized. You could say formally colonized. I think we still colonized.
So do I. You can have pervasive experiences of trauma. And one of the things that frequently happens is that people find it difficult to separate joyful experiences from traumatic experiences. Everything is mashed up together. It's all the same thing. I often reference Stevie Wonder's song, "The Joy Inside My Tears," because that's what it is for a lot of people in a traumatized place, and we are that. And so you think about this joyous thing and it comes with traumatic memories, and you think about this traumatic thing and there are pleasant things wrapped up in there. But identifying distinctly good things on either side of a trauma changes how we experience it.
So those are two starting points. You'd say people can start getting together their stories, unearthing their stories, looking at their stories from different perspectives, and writing down the stories from different perspectives.
Or telling them.
Or right, sorry, telling, yeah, writing or telling the stories from different perspectives. What else did you
We're,
add,
we're, we're an
Karen?
oral tradition people.
Yes, we are.
I just wanted to reinforce that telling the story is very, very, very important, bearing witness. Because the first act in oppression is I remove your story. And if I remove your story, I remove your existence. Look at what was done to, there's a big noise going on about the discovery of the graves of indigenous children
Yeah, my
in
sister's been keeping me
Canada.
abreast of that.
Right. So, and what was done in those schools is we erase their story, we erase their language, we erase their culture, we erase their story completely. So, telling your story, getting people to bear witness and to say, yes, that happened, it's extremely important. So,
May,
writing, telling, having people bear witness to it, it's
may I add
crucial.
something to that, Karen?
Mhm.
Go ahead, JP.
That business of silencing people's stories is really, really critical. It is, as you say, essential to oppression. And so um, my mother's in her 80s, and um, I have heard her recount the story of going to a prestige school in Trinidad and Tobago, for high school, and having um, an expatriate teacher, um, when saying something, her classmates, almost exclusively by that time, um, African and East Indian children, say something about history, and having this English teacher say, "You don't have any history there." I'm not talking about sometime in 18 something.
No, no, no.
This
That
was
would have been in the
in 19
1900s. It would have been in
this
the
was in the 19
1900s.
this is in the 1940s, 1950s. You don't have any history there. And so one of the things that is important, I think we misunderstand. We hear people talking about learning African history and becoming aware of Africa pre um, European invasion and pillaging and massacre. Um, is really important, because if the story that you have as a culture is just the trauma of being invaded and pillaged and raped and murdered and enslaved, if that's the full extent of the story, it's difficult to not be traumatized all the time.
Agreed.
But when you come to realize that all of European civilization is stolen from African and Indian and Chinese civilization, that all of their accomplishments they learn from us, um, yeah, okay. um, it becomes clear that the story of our inferiority is not just fictional, it's gaslighting.
There is a lot of gaslighting, and I mean, we still, to this day, 2021, you hear people saying all kinds of ridiculous things, where they don't believe that they're capable of running a country for themselves, because they still think somebody else needs to run the country. They don't trust their own systems and their own institutions. Again, because they think somebody else should be running the institutions. So yeah, it is a serious thing. Karen, you were going to say something?
Yeah, you raised something very important. So this is jumping back to the other side
Sure.
where you were talking about how do people start to deal with the trauma. And one of the things that is becoming more and more important is having trauma informed structures, classrooms, so that there are structures that are built into the day of your classroom that address trauma issues. And not necessarily we're going to sit down and talk about bad things, but we have structures that create safety, that create a culture, a particular culture of respect and caring and support. And those are the things that anybody who's been traumatized needs. We all need it, and especially those who've been traumatized.
How
And
Especially.
that
how do we replicate that in the home?
So
the
one of the
same
things that
way structures in the home.
Okay.
Yeah, one of the things that I have been trying to address is the place of religiosity in this. Because religious institutions, organizations, and bodies have played such an integral role in the shaping of what happens in homes in our country, across the various religious groups in our country. This is a common thing across the groups. And so one of the things that I have am of the view is that if there is a possibility of having trauma-informed religious engagement, it becomes possible to move towards trauma-informed homes, trauma-informed relationship formation and development and maintenance, trauma-informed parenting. Um, there's a lot of work to be done, and it's the magnitude of the work that needs to be done is really immense.
Well, then that's what I will have to bring you and Karen back to discuss. I will bring you and Karen back, and we're going to be talking about trauma-informed homes and trauma-informed classrooms. So that way, people who are in education or people who are raising children can become more aware about the trauma that they are housing within themselves and how they can improve the environment that they're teaching in or rearing children in to make it, I guess, for there to be less of an impact. They can't remove the impact, but they can at least make lesser, have it have less of a negative impact. Yes.
If I could be so presumptuous, I would like to ask you to at least consider the possibility of including trauma-informed religiosity.
Yeah. I can include that. There's a question here. I don't know if this is a question we can deal with right now, but Angie is asking, when people are dating or looking to get married, how do they treat with the trauma? How do they treat with the trauma both parties have?
Oh Jesus!
I guess
Lord
that's where
have mercy.
couples counseling comes in. You can have like pre-marriage couples counseling, or we could discuss that in the part two.
Can we have a whole separate?
Yes, we can have a
time
whole
for that?
separate live discussion about this treating with each other's trauma while you're in the dating stage of a relationship.
OMG!
Yes, Karen.
Something that I always joke about is when I do an intake with new clients, I do a three generation family tree, and I ask about addiction, abuse, police involvement, mental illness, and I always tell people, when you start dating somebody, you do the three generation genogram and you ask all the questions. You can map everything out. You get all the divorces, the deaths, the miscarriages, this, everything. And when you've got all that detail, then you can look at each other and say, okay, yes, I want to proceed with this, or you may look at the genogram and go, oh hell no.
Of course, it can be very difficult to do in the middle of a fet while
Yeah, it's difficult to do in the middle of it. I guess that's why arranged relationships, it can just be easier, because your parents know he parents or her parents, and and they map everything that would have happened. That's what goes on with arranged marriages. I know.
That's the informal genogram.
I know that's what it is. I know. I mean, if I had continued being raised on the Barth end of things, I could have been, in an arranged marriage, but no, I was spared that. So, I want to thank the two of you for this conversation this evening. It didn't go any way I thought it was going to go. Did not go there, and I'm glad for it. I'm very glad. Very, very, very glad for it. I feel like many members of the audience kind of pause at a point and is like, oh God, we traumatized. They hadn't thought about it. They hadn't thought about how traumatized they were until we started discussing trauma and the ways in which it impacts from an ancestral or intergenerational level.
It's funny because it's true.
Yeah, it is funny because it's true. I mean, there are things that I was aware of before, yes, but when it hit me that, Pearl's ovum and Claude's sperm, is like 50% of my problems right there.
Oh my goodness.
I'm going to have to have a chat with my parents. I'm going to put them sit down. and have some strong words with them. Anyhow, lady and gentlemen, thank you so much. I will be in touch with you for a follow-up because we had to get into the part 2. We need to have another session. So thanks for your
Thank
Friday
you.
evening. JP,
Thank
you
you.
can go and get some rest now. Karen, you can go and relax for the rest of the evening.
What is that?
Thank you.
You don't rest, JP?
He doesn't.
I've heard of it.
You know you might be exposing yourself to trauma, JP.
I agree. I concur.
He needs help.
Yes, he needs help. I know a really good clinical psychologist. You want me to recommend?
Sure, that would be helpful.
I will
That would be
recommend
helpful.
you. I'll recommend
Pro-
you. All
That
right.
would be helpful.
Have a good evening, folks.
Take
All
care.
right.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
So we're gonna have a part 2 because there are more things that I need to be able to discuss. I certainly want to get into other aspects of how we address on Earth trauma, and of course, how do you make any environment, whether it's your home environment, your work environment, your learning environment, I guess like a trauma-friendly space or an enabling space where you can feel more nurtured. So I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I hope you learned something about trauma and how trauma, whether it is ancestral or intergenerational, how it affects you and how it affects how you proceed and progress with your life and how you make choices with respect to your life. So have yourselves a good Friday evening. Thanks so much for joining me. I'm going to try and de-stress now. I feel like I discussed trauma for a while. So take care, folks.
I may not be right for you, but I'm right for somebody. Yeah, 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 yeah,
Oh, I'll see you all on Sunday, all right? So look out for a session on Sunday.
A real